It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Okay, I'm going to be bringing on our next guest here, Andrew Crieg, and he's the author of Presidential Puppetry. Now, I'm going to kind of do this on the fly because you have no idea the technical difficulties I've had today. Normally I got technical difficulties, but this was a really rough day. As a matter of fact, I got a virus today, and I got it from Andrew Crieg. So let's see. Andrew, how are you? We're live on the air on the Opperman Report.
Great.
How are you, my friend?
Doing good. I heard your previous interview, and I'm thrilled to be on the show myself, Ed.
Thank you very much, and thank you for helping me book Mr. Michael Springman, a very cool guest, and you helped me out with that. Thank you very much.
Oh, there's a lot of great information there, and so many timely topics that are in the news right now, and that actually I've studied, and I found your discussion quite enlightening, and I may even be able to add a few things about some of those topics. So,
well, great.
Fire away.
Okay. Well, let's start with who you are and about your book, Presidential Puppetry, and presidentialpuppetry.com, and give us a little background on yourself, and then we'll get started with you.
Okay. Basically, I'm a longtime reporter, which was my first career, covering stories for a Metro Daily. And then I became an attorney, and then a business executive, and then I went back to my original job as a reporter, because there were so many things that I saw in my 25 years here in Washington that just didn't seem to make sense. So after a dozen years heading a global trade association in the high-tech sector, in 2008 I began investigative reporting, taking a look at criminal prosecutions that didn't really seem to make sense. And I wrote up a number of exposés, as I used to do probably 25, 30 years before, on places like the Huffington Post and elsewhere. And then nothing happened after the facts were exposed, often in very high-profile cases, mind-boggling problems. And so then I started digging deeper, looking at, well, who's appointing these judges and prosecutors? Yeah. And that led to the whole world of political opposition, stuff that just happens in the news behind the scenes that even most reporters don't know anything about. Basically political hit jobs that are made to just look like ordinary events. Sometimes people are framed and sent to prison, sometimes just exposed in sex scandals. And that led to this book, Presidential Puppetry, Obama, Romney, and their masters. I'm being a little dramatic here, but ultimately it led to the conclusion, documented in about 1,300 endnotes, that these people that we think are running things really aren't. Almost all of them have been groomed. The puppet masters don't know which ones are going to win, but just like a college football coach might recruit, 5 different people to be involved with the CIA or FBI before they entered politics, and that part is kept secret. And these kinds of hidden relationships are not necessarily all bad. I mean, I covered law enforcement, and of course most of what they do is a good thing for the public. But the things I'm talking about should at least be known. and they're not known for many of the reasons that you talked with Mike about, and which I think you know from your career as a PI. So that's kind of the background.
Well, give us an idea here, Andrew, because everybody knows that Obama's a Muslim. Everybody knows that he's what do you call it? A terrorist, probably, right? And he comes from Kenya,
right.
you know. And he's
No,
a Marxist.
disinformation.
Yeah, he's a Leninist. He's a Stalinist.
Yeah.
So, what did you come up with along those lines?
Well, I often try to make it a dialogue so as not to seem like a know-it-all. Actually, some people don't like the dialogue, but I haven't tried it out here, so I'll do it. But I'll often, at a lecture, ask people, okay, I've got a little prize here, and I'll give away a book or a coffee mug, and I'll say, who can tell me what President Obama's first job out of college was? What did he do? And I almost never have to give away the book or a mug. Nobody knows. And I'm talking about reporters, you know, who I just got back from the National Press Club. By the way, I'm based right on Pennsylvania Avenue, almost a stone's throw, not that I would, from the Justice Department, FBI headquarters. So I'm right in the middle of things, and I belong to a number of the major press clubs and organizations, and sometimes I'll just ask that question. What do you think President Obama did? They don't know. And more important, people don't care.
Yeah.
I might ask, what do you think President Obama's mother did for a living? And most people don't know, they don't care, or they're completely wrong. So now that your listeners have had a chance to think about that, should I mention what the answer is and why it's important?
I'll take a guess. Didn't he work for Baskin Robbins at one point in his life?
Oh, yeah. No, his first job out of college.
I don't know.
Well, nobody knows.
Yeah.
Except it's right there. Except it's not there. So in his autobiography, he doesn't mention it. He just has a paragraph that says, well, I worked for some research company, and it was so boring, I wanted to be a community organizer.
Really?
And so that's kind of the way most people look at it. And they say, well, gee, whatever his job was, it was boring, right? So why should anybody care? Well, the actual answer, and I discovered this when a friend of mine and Mike Springman's former Navy intelligence officer, Wayne Madsen, who's also an author, took me to the National Archives in February of 2009. So everybody's all abuzz, because here's this new community organizer. President Obama's taken office, and he's a big liberal, and everybody's saying, well, he's leftist. He hung around with radicals, and but other people say it doesn't matter. He's going to be a progressive. So Wayne takes me to National Archives because he knows I've gone back to reporting after business. He wants to show me how to look up declassified CIA documents, which is a little bit of a process, but. So he was doing some of the same research for himself. So we get this thing, and so here's the answer to it. President Obama worked from 1983 to 84 for Business International Corporation. And that sounds kind of boring, particularly if you know that it was an import and export research company. But Ed, the story starts getting more interesting when you see the document that he called up that quoted the owner or co-owner as saying it had been a CIA front company.
Really?
Yeah. So, and then you start thinking, I think from your photo and voice, you're too young for this, but I'm sure you've heard of James Bond. And particularly in the early movies and books, before they got infatuated with gadgets, you see that James Bond, when he introduced himself, didn't say he worked for a spy company. He said he worked for an import-export company, Universal Exports. And that's what Valerie Flame worked for. And that's what a lot of people work for, because it sounds so stinking boring. But it kind of explains why people would go running around the country and study things. And so just like Mike Springman, your previous guest, says that a lot of the Foreign Service officers are really CIA, working for an import-export research company is a great cover. And it makes a lot of difference if you're a community organizer after you work for the CIA front company.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you go back to the mother's work, and everybody thinks, well, she's some hippie, single mother. She's trying to help the poor people in all these places. And then, again, I'm not the original researcher on a lot of this stuff, but I did put together a kind of comprehensive book of 50 years of this history. And you start looking at, well, who did the mother work for? Well, it's a little vague. But you start penetrating and you see, wait a second, her boss was Peter Geithner. Now, where have we heard this name Geithner before? It's the father of Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary.
Oh, boy. Okay.
And this is in Indonesia. Peter Geithner works at the Ford Foundation. You say, oh, those are the nice people who hand out the money to everybody. We're very nice people. Well, who was head of it? A guy named McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for both President Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and one of the main architects of the Vietnam War. And then he went and spent 12 years as head of the Ford Foundation. And then you look at, McGeorge Bundy. Where does that trail lead? Well, he's Yale Skull and Bones. Only 15 people a year picked to be Skull and Bones. By the way, in 2004, two of them, John Kerry and George Bush, were running against one another for president. What a coincidence. At any rate, McGeorge Bundy, who's on top of this, suddenly goes from helping run the Vietnam War, which was a CIA operation at the beginning, and he never went to graduate school, but he becomes dean of Harvard College in the 50s, and he hires both Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski to be faculty members, both of whom become national security advisors themselves. And when Obama went to Columbia, the head of his department was Brzezinski, and then he picks Brzezinski to be his major advisor during his 2008 campaign. And where do we hear this name Brzezinski? Oh, Mika Brzezinski. She's on MSNBC. So what we see here, and I'm only touching, just briefly here, what we see is a whole set of relationships that are totally unknown, except to researchers who can never get their information out after a certain level.
Yep.
Now, that's one of the reasons I like your show after I started listening to it, because you're cutting through this, and your listeners should know that as far as I know from, the few episodes that I've listened to, you're really telling it like it is. And if they go to other sources, there's a high chance that this kind of information is going to be blocked for some of the reasons you were talking about with Mike, but also a certain human element of arrogance and curiosity, lack of curiosity. So a lot of the people in the media or in politics, their view is they know it all. So they actually become angry at, as I've seen, at even a slight bit of this conversation.
Yeah.
Because it threatens their ego, their job, their worldview, and it's amazing. I mean, and yet, if somebody is not personally involved, let's say a cab driver or a waiter, I find that they're often curious, and their questions are very smart, often, but they don't have the emotional hang-up that they know it all. And I hope I don't project that. I'm trying to talk quickly, but I am constantly learning new things, reading new books, and doing it with a view that I've still got a lot to learn. But a big advantage that I have is, one, I don't feel threatened by what I don't know, so that I can look at it. The other thing is I'm pissed off, frankly, because as an attorney in Washington, as a longtime reporter with more than 40 years' experience, I'm supposed to know this stuff, and it's been denied me, and I feel like a chump because it's right there if you know where to look. So let me end on that, let you get in your question.
Because you know what? You were talking about how, you're right, we're going to catch hell for this show tonight. Because on TalkStream Live, which is the ratings book for all the online radio shows that are on right now, right now I can look at it, Michael Savage is number 1, we're number 8. We're ahead of Sean Hannity right now. But in the hashtag, I put Obama is CIA. And you know as well as I know, that the knee-jerk reaction, 90% of the people on that, on that right-wing, website are going to see that their heads are going to explode. This guy's crazy.
Well, let me tell you something about that, because one of the features of my book, which let me tout as a strength, is that I talk to people both on the far right, the far left, the middle, mainstream, and wherever they come from, if they've got something to say, I want to hear it.
Yeah, me too.
So for 7 years, I used to run a radio show called Washington Update, and my co-host was a Tea Party enthusiast, and we'd invite all kinds of people. Most of them were mainstream authors and so forth, but a lot of times on the fringe. And here's what I would say to the people whose heads want to explode. First, on the right. Very well-connected people I know and I'm friendly with on the right, not blowhards, but very serious operatives who make a living by being close to power on the right. They've told me that what's in my book is entirely accurate. And I wouldn't want to quote them. These are personal friends. They've also said that the reason that this information doesn't get out is that their base of on the right is people who want to hate Obama.
Right.
So their outlets can't say, well, he's part of the game. He's like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and his thing is pro-immigrant and gay rights, but on the big issues like war and this Trans-Pacific Partnership, do you notice? I'm sure you did, Ed. But virtually all Senate Democrats had to oppose him on this Trans-Pacific Partnership because it's not progressive at all. And ultimately, he and most of these Democrats just put up a show, but they caved in because their big money bankers say, this is why we put you in. You're supposed to give us the wars, the free trade, and and that's why we put you in office. And on the left, there's another dynamic going on where people have gotten emotionally involved with his story about him being a big progressive,
right.
And they don't want to think that they've been made a chump out of, and yet they have, and so my conclusion after doing this for a while and having a lot of conversations is that the mainstream people do not want this. This threatens their jobs, their psychology. But the people on the far right and far left are much more open to it because they're pissed off. They know something's wrong. and the explanation I've put together in Presidential Puppetry, which quotes many other people, by the way, is much more logical than what you're going to get in the Washington Post.
Yeah, or even MSNBC.
Definitely MSNBC, because, again, having started my career 14 years as a newspaper reporter, my first book was about the economics of the newspaper industry, and the title was Spiked, S-P-I-K-E-D, subtitle, How Chain Management Corrupted America's Oldest Newspaper. And it looked at how the chains really have an interest in helping stockholders more than the communities. And it was a case history of how news is stifled or pumped up that really doesn't quite relate to what people would think. So, Ed, I was told this by the curator of the Pulitzer Prizes, I'm the first American to go to Pulitzer Prize headquarters, look up the applications, and then go back to the community to see if they're accurate. Now, you'd think, since the place is based at Columbia University, there'd be lots of people doing that. But really, it's an old boy network. And actually, I misspoke. It wasn't so much the curator of the Pulitzers, but it was 8 feet across the hall. It was Spencer Claw, who was editor of the Columbia Journalism Review and also a professor at Columbia Journalism School. And I said, why isn't anybody else done this? He says, well, we suggest it from time to time, but none of the students want to do it. Well, if nobody's checking, I found incredible exaggerations and other aberrations, and I can proudly report a success on this, or two successes, Ed. One is I became persona non grata. And I thought I was just going to reveal the stuff, and all these ombudsmen and media critics would look at the footnotes and take it from there. But I become the bad guy. So that was 25 years ago, and it was a great lesson for my later career in Washington, which is getting into business and law, and to suspect everything, but also don't expect that people are going to be grateful. The other triumph, in a way, is all of this stuff is now under lock and key, so nobody can do what I did.
Okay.
So instead of reforming the system, they said, well, we don't want people doing this anymore. So you have to be authorized to do this to look at the applications. If you can't look at the applications, you can't really see, the kind of potential exaggerations. So you just have to accept that, they deserved what they got, right?
So we can't even see what the applications were.
No, not anymore.
Oh wow! Yeah, you're right.
You could when I did this in 1986, and then I wrote my book in 1987, and suddenly we can't have that. So, as a PI, you might appreciate this.
Yeah.
I was so naive that I thought all these journalism magazines would like what I'm doing,
Yeah.
but instead, none of them would report any of this. I was just going to do an article, and they all basically told me the same thing. You seem to be making serious allegations about Pulitzers and things, and we can't print anything unless it's independently confirmed, and we don't have any personnel to confirm it, so goodbye. And so that's when I wrote a book, which was its own news peg. And I'm thinking, all three of these journalism reviews are associated with major universities. Why can't they find somebody, a professor or student, to check it out, since I documented everything? But that's the way it works, Ed. And then here, I love the way, I'm getting maybe a little backwards in time, but I'll come up to the present if you like. But, I still remember what the Columbia Journalism Review wrote about me. A very left-handed compliment. They said, he's the kind of reporter that every publisher hates because he knows where all the bodies are buried, and he brings a skeptical, harsh attitude. And I'm looking at this, I think, wait a second. First of all, what does my attitude have to do with it? Two, I'm actually a fairly gregarious and pleasant person. But more important, isn't the question, why are there dead bodies? As opposed to what degree of happiness I have that I know where all they are. I mean, what do you think?
That's a good one, yeah. Yeah, you would think
but
so.
But you see,
right?
that's the attitude that they had then. And again, it's prepared me for to be reasonably successful in business here in Washington, but also to be ready to take the blows on this kind of much more heavy-duty research.
Now, you've uncovered connections to CIA with the other candidates as well.
Yeah. Well, I've actually mostly looked at presidents. So let's start with the Bush family, because we're likely to have Jeb Bush here. But people... the conventional wisdom is that George H.W. Bush got involved with the CIA in 1976. He served for a year, and that's it. But actually, it's fairly easy to document if somebody looks that in 1953, his company, Zapata, was another CIA front company. His co-founder of the company was involved for much of his career with the CIA, including publicly. His name is Thomas Devine. He's still alive. Love to interview these guys, but they're not talking. So you basically have President George H.W. Bush, fairly soon after he got out of college, is involved with the CIA. And in a big way, because his company was called Zapata Offshore, and one of the things they did was oil exploration in the Caribbean. You think, well, okay, sounds kind of boring, right? Well, what's going on in the Caribbean? For one thing, it's great. It's kind of like being in the import-export business. It's a great excuse to go traveling all around and poking your nose into different dictatorships and movements and acting like a business. And by coincidence, that's not really a coincidence, the Bay of Pigs invasion was called Operation Zapata. And think if you're exploring the undersea of the Caribbean around Cuba, how many maps you're going to have, And you start looking at this, as I have, and one thing leads to another. It's all documented in books, and it's a little like Mike Springman's book that, checks out as far as it goes, but nobody takes it to the next level of, MSNBC or even the Amy Goodman show. Yeah. And you were talking about that in the last hour, and I can say that, one of the ways that that control is exercised is to, let shows like hers deal with a certain level of liberal topics and get people outraged within narrow confines. But there are certain things that you don't go. Like anything we're talking about, anything that Mike's talking about, the JFK assassination. All of these things are strictly verboten on even the so-called liberal shows, and we can now see, and anybody could look them up, some of the documents that explain why. And if you look at the funding, it's all there. It's just that people are busy, and if they're not listening to a show like yours, they're not going to know where to look.
Yeah, I agree with you. Democracy Now! And these shows, they get that funding, that we don't get.
Well, here's a very specific way. And it actually goes back to a little something that Mike, who lives in Washington, as I do, we start reading these obituaries, and you see, so-and-so, a major publishing executive or whatever, and then there's this little paragraph, he began his career as a CIA officer, and you think, wow, well, that's kind of interesting. And I'm not saying Amy Goodman is like that, but here's what I am saying. When Bill Moyers retired again in January, the Washington Post had this long story about his career, and they said he's in charge of the Bill Moyers Foundation with assets of $28 million that helps give grants to such programs as Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, about $700,000 a year, as I recall, Mother Jones, The Nation, and a bunch of liberal publications. And a friend of mine who researches the JFK stuff, which I'm belatedly looking at quite intensely, and I'm in touch on a daily basis with the top researchers. But one of the guys who's been studying this for 40 years, when I wrote about this Bill Moyers Foundation, he said, boing, or the words to that effect, he said, the bells go off. None of those shows or magazines will touch the real story of the JFK assassination. And then you start thinking, well, what was Bill Moyers doing in 1960?
He was there in Dallas, yeah.
Well, not only that, he was communications director for Vice President Lyndon Johnson.
Oh, really?
And the day after the assassination, he became communications director for President Johnson.
Wow.
And if you look at the declassified memos, I'm getting a cold chill talking about this, you see that the number 2 guy at the Justice Department, right under Bobby Kennedy, wrote a long memo to Bill Moyers on November 25th, 3 days after the assassination, and he said in the memo, which anybody can look up now, the most important thing is to convince the American people that Lee Harvey Oswald did this acting alone, and that there was nobody else involved. And that's what we're working on. I'm paraphrasing here, but people can look it up. And so once you come to believe, as I have, and I explain a little bit more why, but once you come to believe that there was clearly a cover-up there, I won't even get into, unless you ask, who did it and why, but there's clearly a cover-up. Oswald couldn't have been acting alone. If there was a cover-up, Bill Moyers was in charge.
Mm. Yeah,
in effect. And so he's never written a book about this. He's a very eloquent guy. He's a former minister. He's done a lot of good in the world. But the one thing he will not talk about in any depth is this. And this is a big stinking deal. This was his biggest breakthrough, was, orchestrating, let's not use a loaded term, even though I did cover up. Let's just say the news coverage of the Kennedy assassination. He's the guy. And whatever else he's done, he will not talk about that. And the Bill Moyers Foundation, that's helping the nation, Democracy Now! And PBS and all these people, has a vested interest in not having them talk about it.
Well, let's get into that for a second. What is your conclusion on the reason for killing JFK and who killed him?
Well, I've written we haven't talked about this, but I'm the editor and one of the founding directors of a investigative reporting organization called the Justice Integrity Project.
Okay.
That was, we've done a 24-part series of a reader's guide that started out by, listing all of the important books, no matter what their conclusion was, Warren Commission, whatever, and all the important movies and perspectives. And gradually, as I've learned more about this, and I've now got almost 100 books on the topic, we get more interpretive. And I'll give your listeners an advance look at one of our next columns, probably be 25 in this reader's guide. And it takes a look at all of Lee Harvey Oswald's jobs, basically. And it turns out that there's very, very solid evidence that every single one of them was a front. And that, he's a former Marine, but, and they say, well, he's a loner, he's a Russian defector, the communist and everything. Well, here's another way to look at it, almost like the Obama situation. If he's a Marine and he's gung-ho and they tell him what to do, that's what he did. So let's look at some of his jobs. How many of your listeners, I can't hear them, but have thought about what one of his jobs in the Marines was? He worked on the most secret spy program in the entire United States, the U-2 spy program. So he was over at Japan as a radar technician, helping, the coding and logistics for the U-2 spy plane. And this is before anybody knew about it, when Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Russia. And so Oswald defects from the United States under very suspicious circumstances, if you look at it, and he brings over a bunch of stuff about the U-2 spy plane. And that could make him look, in a sense, like the biggest traitor you could imagine. But one of the things about intelligence is they often like to dangle something that people want to get. So, the Russians knew that there was a spy plane, but they didn't know much about it. So here's this guy that comes over, says, I worked on it. I can bring you the codes. Now, Ed, I'm sure you've seen the movie, and most of your listeners have. Remember the movie From Russia with Love? I think it was the second or third one. It's the one where the beautiful Daniela Bianchi, the Russian interpreter, pretends to fall in love with James Bond.
Yeah, okay.
And she's going to bring him the decoding machine. So James Bond and the M and all these people, they kind of think there's something suspicious about this, but they figure, well, a chance to get a decoding machine. And so Bond goes off to meet her to get the decoding machine. That's the same thing in reverse. We send Oswald over there with the YouTube spy stuff, and the Russians are thinking, well, we'd kind of like to get this, but what's the story here, By the way, let me tell one more James Bond thing. The author of that, Ian Fleming, turns out to have been a top-level guy in British Navy intelligence. So he was like assistant to the director of all British naval intelligence during World War II. Think of how high up that is.
Yeah, right.
And so this stuff that's James Bond is not just some author making it up, but like a lot of this stuff, it's coming right from a guy, Ian Fleming, who was involved in doing it. And here's one other story, is that before he was writing the James Bond stuff, or while he was doing it, Ian Fleming went from British Navy intelligence to becoming European editor for a major news syndicate called the North American News Alliance, which was actually funded by British intelligence. So here you have a news organization that later syndicated, like former President Harry Truman's columns and so forth, that's basically run secretly by intelligence. By the way, every single thing that I've said is either documented on the justice-integrity.org website and or in the book Presidential Puppetry with its 1,300 endnotes. So, what I'm doing, I'm connecting the dots of things that other people have done, but run into the kind of brick wall that so many writers on this do. They get to a certain level, they think, holy cow, I've got this, but it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. So, but you're convinced it was CIA that killed Kennedy and Johnson.
Pardon me?
Your conclusion is it was CIA that killed Kennedy and Johnson?
Well, not necessarily Johnson, although some people think that. The way I would look at it is the CIA is basically the operational arm for what I call the puppet masters. So the CIA back then, and to some extent now, first of all, 95% of the people who work there, and I know many of them. In fact, I point out in the book that my mother was a well-known reporter and writer in New York, and I looked up her boss because she was a covert operative, and on that same. So I'm not hostile to people. I'm just descriptive. So 95% of the people are just doing their job, looking forward to Friday and the weekend, and don't know any of this stuff really. But at the very top levels, people like Alan Dulles, who was the longest-serving director, and some of his successors, their background is Wall Street lawyers, and serving the highest level of oligarchs at the Rockefeller and Harriman level. So they're basically stewards of what the tiniest, richest people in American history want to do. So while, and to go back to answer your question, it's my belief that certain rogue executives at the CIA helped orchestrate the killing using mafia and other sharpshooters, set up Oswald as a patsy, got him that job at the Texas Book Depository, and but the people who really, really wanted it done, for the most part, weren't even in government. They're the people who wanted to keep the Vietnam War going. They're the people who wanted to take back Cuba, who were against desegregation, which was very big in 1963, and didn't want Kennedy to remove Johnson from the ticket. And Kennedy was going to end the Vietnam War, which had 16,000 people, and he had issued an order in October 1963, just before he was killed, to start the phase down. And so there are a whole bunch of things going on there, probably 5 of them, that the ultra-wealthy, particularly those who just hated communism and were involved in global manipulations, really didn't want. and they were only too happy to. Those few knew what the situation was to take him out.
And the motive was to keep the Vietnam War going, to keep segregation.
Well, it's probably about 4 or 5 motives, and depending on, I mean, some of the Northerners probably didn't care that much about. They may even like desegregation, but some of the people in the South hated that, so that may have been their biggest motive. So there may have been more than one motive, depending on who it was. Now, it's important to remember a few things also that are just totally fascinating. It could be coincidence, or maybe not. But one is that Kennedy had forced out, in effect fired, Allen Dulles from the CIA. He also fired, and let the listeners try to think where I'm going next on this, but he fired 2 other people, and one was General Charles Cable, who was one of the 2 assistant directors under Dulles, and Cable's brother was mayor of Dallas.
Oh,
Earl
really?
Cable. Huh?
I didn't know that.
Nobody wants you to know, except me.
That's a good one.
2 other people. And by the way, people could even look up on Wikipedia a lot of this stuff, although I think on certain sensitive things, Wikipedia is influenced by its anonymous editors, and I know that for a fact. But they can't run everything, and you could look up the Peter Geithner thing, for example, when basically no newspaper would ever write about it. And here's Tim Geithner, is one of the most powerful people in the whole country for the entire first term. But at any rate, back to Dallas, and then you start looking at, where was the protection, and what's the standard of protection here? Well, the Secret Service did not write on the back bumpers. A lot of people have seen the YouTube of them being called off riding on the back bumper. The motorcycle formation was not the usual one surrounding the president. They didn't check the windows, which they'd been doing ever since the 1930s. And there were no Dallas police or county police in Dealey Plaza where he was killed. And you think, well, wait a second, you look at this thing, Dealey Plaza, it's like a killing zone, because he's coming in, he's taking a right turn, a car comes almost to a stop in front of the Dallas Book Depository.
Where there happens to be a Russian defector working.
Yeah, where the Russian defector is working, and then there's this picket fence on a hill that's like 90 feet. I was down there, and you look at this, you say, wait a second. Even somebody who's fired a BB gun once when as a 12-year-old could shoot from behind that fence, the 90 feet, to shoot at Kennedy. And, it could be from all sides.
Yeah.
And, there's 6 or 7, I've got a list of 6 or 7 people who have admitted that they were involved in the killing. By the way, none of them was Oswald. But, these are mob guys that, were caught on tape recordings. A couple of them have even written books saying that they were involved. And Oswald may never have been up on the 6th floor. I mean, he might have been. But Ed, in my view, some of these details are not so important. I mean, they're important, but they're not crucial. So whether Oswald was in it to some extent or not, I think he was to some extent. That doesn't mean he fired a gun, but he was definitely involved to some extent. But the critical point is we're not getting the whole story. And when I run into people, which I do all the time, and say, well, it's a long time ago, who knows, who cares? I say, I go to your list of what you were talking about with Mike a few minutes ago. Benghazi, Seymour Hersh's article this week. And I say, well, how do you expect to figure out these things without some context to the murder of the president in broad daylight and a phony investigation. and so we're supposed to pay attention to what Cy Hirsch is saying and develop some kind of judgment without knowing ascertainable facts about the murder of a president. What do you think?
And who trusts Cy Hirsch to begin with? Because he's in there with these guys as well, you know?
Well, I just actually published an article column today,
Yeah.
and I didn't reach an ultimate conclusion on that, but what I did was I presented his story and hot links, and then arguments pro and con. And here's what I would say. I've known him for years.
Okay.
We used to work in the same building at 1140 Connecticut Avenue when I was in business, but I respected his work, and once or twice I invited him up to my office, and we chewed the fat. And I saw him just 2 weeks ago, and I'd given him a copy of my book and asked him what he thought about it, and he was kind of busy. It was a big lunch, and he was gracious about it. But he's working on his own stuff. I would say he's very courageous. He's definitely got sources, but in this current environment where yet another former CIA officer went to prison on spy charges just this week, that all of us who work in this environment are taking some risk, because anybody who's in the room and who actually knows what's going on would go to prison if they talked with any of us.
True.
So we got to be at least one step away from reality, and more likely 2 or 3. And then you got the problem of, even if you've trusted your sources, are they so scared now in this current environment that they're going to fool you? So even if he had 2 sources, and by the way, I quoted somebody to this effect, even if he had 2 sources, how does he know that the 2 sources have not are not ignorant of certain key facts, or haven't been pressured to fool him?
Right. Hey,
and that, by the way, happens all the time, and that's why we've got to know history.
Real quick, Andrew, because we're down to like the last 2 minutes. Now,
okay.
We have another hour, though, if you want to hang out and take some phone calls and keep talking.
Oh, I'd love to.
All right, great. But
Sure.
we're going to be dropping 2 big stations. We're going to be dropping PSN, and we're going to be dropping Talk Superstation. So if there's anything you want to, how can people get a hold of you? How can they get a hold of your book? That kind of stuff.
Well, great. Well, first of all, my main site is justice-integrity.org. It's a daily website of news roundup and investigative news about this kind of thing in the media. People can write me, andrew.crieg, Kreig, at gmail.com. But if you join a group and invite somebody you like, me, you, Ed, or somebody to be a speaker, this can all make a very positive difference. And so I'm quite hopeful if people take action in their own interests.
Okay, great. So this was our guest tonight, Andrew Crieg,